You're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. I'm your host, Shane Darby. After a wee bit of a summer break, we're back in harness to explore the life and times of Harry Shapland Colt, aka Harry Colt, widely considered to be the father of modern golf course architecture. I'm very pleased to report that Adam Lawrence, one of the foremost Colt experts, joins us today to explore his legacy and influence on the golden age of golf course architecture and beyond. Adam is the principal at Oxford Golf Consulting and also the editor of Golf Course Architecture magazine. He is currently also hard at work on the definitive book on the life and times of Harry Colt, entitled More Enduring Than Brass, a tip of the cap to a poem by Horace, and an echo of Bernard Darwin's description of Colts done loose course at Royal Portrush during the Open Championship of 1951. If this is your first time listening to the pod, you are very welcome. Indeed, if you're a returning listener, well, welcome back. Please remember to like, subscribe and review. It really is appreciated and it really does help. With the introduction sorted, it's now time to join our conversation about Harry Colt. Hi Adam, you're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. It's great to have you here.
Hi Shane, good to be here.
Super. Listen, I've been following Paul Larson, the superintendent at Royal St George's, on his Twitter account for most of the summer. It would appear that the east coast of England, where you're located, has been pretty dry these past few months.
Yeah, although as we just mentioned, it's started to rain quite a bit these last 4 or 5 days. God knows we need it. So.
Paul's rain dance has done the trick. I'm just interested now how your beloved Princes has fared with the lack of rain in South East England this summer.
I must confess, I've hardly been at Princes this year. I was there about a month ago and it was dry, very dry. But I think they're just about all right. Those guys have got plenty of irrigation water on in the story if they need it. So.
Good stuff. Well, listen, just as an introductory piece and for the benefit of our listeners who don't know who Adam Lawrence is, you might just give us a quick intro to who Adam Lawrence is.
Well, do you want me to start at the beginning and go forwards, or do you want me to start at the end and go backwards?
Whatever you wish, my man. Whatever you wish.
So, I have been, well, let's gloss over the first 30-odd years. I've been a journalist all my life since I left university, and in 2005, when I was working for a publishing company in Leicester called Julia Rose, the head of editorial, I got involved in the launching of GCA magazine. I was the only member of our editorial team who was a golfer, so it became my baby, and over the years I spent more and more time on it. In 2012, I lost both my parents in 2010-11 within 5 months, and inherited a certain amount of cash from them, which gave me a bit of freedom, and I decided to leave Julia Rose and go solo in 2012, since which time I've spent all my time trying to report on golf design and earn living doing just that. I do PR for various companies in the golf industry. I edit GCA on contract, and as you know, I've been writing Harry Colt's biography for too damn long.
And I guess given the fact that you are indeed currently writing a biography on Harry Colt, I can think of nobody better to explore the central role that Colt played in creating the profession of golf course architecture. In essence, this is the first episode of our Old Dead Guys series from a course design perspective. Obviously, Harry's influence was felt directly and indirectly, far and wide through mainland UK, Ireland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, North and South America, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand and Japan, if I've not left anywhere out there. For those listeners that may not be aware, I think probably the best place to start is a brief outline on the Colt family tree of partners, associates, influencers and influences. We'll investigate some of these avenues specifically as we progress chronologically through Harry's life, his experiences and his achievements.
Well, so Colt obviously was the founding secretary of Sunningdale from 1901 onwards. And from 1907, he started to transition into being a golf architect. In about 1909, when he got the job to create Stoke Burgess, Hugh Allison became the founding secretary there, and pretty much at the same time started assisting Colt with his work. The first hard evidence that we have of Allison as a golf architect is a drawing of Luffenham Heath, which, if I remember rightly, was done in 1911 or 12. And Allison and Colt were partners for the rest of Colt's life, and almost Allison's life. He died not that long after Colt. Colt first met Alistair MacKenzie in 1908 when he was asked to advise on the design of Alwoodley, which obviously Dr. MacKenzie, who was a founding member of the club, wanted to do. I think the committee were pretty nervous about handing over their course project to somebody who had no experience of the question altogether. And they said, well, okay, you can do it, but we're going to get an expert in to review what you're doing and tells you not barking completely the wrong tree. Colt and Mackenzie became friends, and post-World War I became partners, although it was a pretty semi-detached partnership. They weren't together for very long. After the split with Mackenzie in the early 20s, John Morrison came on board as eventually the third partner, and Morrison lived into early 60s and kept the company name going until his death. In terms of sort of informal associates, Colt had quite a significant influence on Donald Ross fairly early in his career, because Ross was asked to build Colt's design at Old Elm in Chicago, and also worked with him at Indian Hill on the same trip. Stanley Thompson in Canada was known to be hugely influenced by Colt. Obviously, the Colt influence spread very much to Japan when Hugh Allison went there. Colt and Morrison particularly did a lot of courses across Europe and through Germany, the Stockholm Golf Club in Sweden, lots in France. Colt was responsible for introducing golf to Spain when he built Puerto de Hierro in Madrid and did several of the courses in Spain. And there were Colt influence courses spread across the world. There's one done in Trinidad, which was done by way of sending a plasticine model out there, done from topographic maps. There was another one in the west of Canada, in Calgary, which was done in 1912-13, again from topographic maps, using a plasticine model. Allison did some work in Australia via topographic maps. Allison did quite a bit of work in South Africa. He did a course in Tenerife. He worked in Morocco. Allison, whether he was inherently, sort of a fairly travel-oriented guy, he traveled all over the world at times. He's quite a footloose in a sense. And obviously, there is the influence through Mackenzie into the Australian and US markets as well. And something I discovered quite recently, which is rather lovely. If you have read Fred Hawtrey's book on Colt, at the back of that book, there is possibly the most interesting, certainly from my perspective as a researcher, there is a selection of letters between Colt slightly and Allison and Morrison primarily. And in those after Colt's death, Morrison says that he's been asked to go out to Kuwait to design a golf course by the oil company, which at the time was just about to start pumping oil from the Kuwaiti desert. And he was going to fly out there. So he flew out there by BOAC, taking about 3 days and stopping in practically every hill and ditch across Europe. And he led out a course in the desert, which was obviously not grass, it was a sand course. And he came home. And the course is still there. Now, I discovered that early this year, and since then I've been trying to figure out a way to get to Kuwait to see it. I've actually approached the Kuwait Oil Company, but I haven't had a response as to whether there's anything interesting. So if any listeners happen to have a contact with the Kuwait Oil Company, then please contact me at adam@oxfordgolfconsulting.com.
Wait till I get my little black book out for you. Listen, that's great just in terms of broad brushstrokes, in terms of Colts' influences and the wider sort of partner side of things. We might initially focus on Harry's early life. I believe upon his father's death, young Harry was dispatched to Malvern in the Worcestershire Hills. And it was here that he fell in love with the game of golf under the tutelage of one Douglas Rolland, originally from Ely Golf Club in Scotland, and James Braid's cousin, no less. What can you tell us about young Colt's early dalliance with golf, and indeed the influence that Rolland had on the young Harry?
Well, none of this is particularly well. A lot of this is not speculation exactly, but it's inference, shall we say. It seems certain to me that Colt started playing golf in the first place because Colt was the youngest of his family, and his brother George, to whom he was clearly quite close, was significantly older than he was. George Colt played golf. He first appears in the minute books at the Worcestershire Golf Club in Malvern in 1882, when Colt himself would have been 12 or 13. Harry first appears in those in 1887, which is quite interesting because that was really not very long before he went to Cambridge. So by the time he started playing golf at Cambridge, he really hadn't been playing golf for very long, and he clearly got quite good quite quickly. As far as Rolland is concerned, Rolland is a very interesting figure, as you know. He was basically forced out of Scotland because somebody brought a paternity suit against him. He didn't appear in the court to answer the suit, and consequently was charged with contempt. Now, obviously, you probably know, the courts do not take kindly to people who are guilty of contempt of court, and he would be in a lot of trouble for that. So he left Scotland. Obviously, Scottish law at the time didn't apply in England, and he was basically unable to return to Scotland, which is why he was unable to appear in the Open between 1884 and 1894. And in both those Opens, he finished second. 1884 was the last time he could play in Scotland. 1894 was the first time the Open was at Royal St George's at Sandwich, so in England. Rolland was clearly a very fine golfer. His course record around Malvern was a 71, when the best score at the time, by an amateur was an 80. He stayed at Malvern until 1890. Then he went to the Limpsfield Chart Club, which was the first course on the Surrey Heath. And then he went to Rye in 1894, and that's when he and Colt met up again, I believe. And obviously they together were responsible for the second iteration of the Rye course.
It's interesting, I wasn't aware that Harry hadn't started until nearly about the same time that he went to Cambridge, because obviously he was at Cambridge, I believe, between 1887 and 1890, following in his father's footsteps at Clare College, obviously studying law. I'm led to believe also that he captained the Cambridge golf team during his time at the university, and undoubtedly, by the sounds of it, became a very good player pretty quickly. Just looking at his record in the amateur championship over the following years, I believe he had 3 quarter-final appearances, with his best result being a semi-final appearance in 1906. How important do you feel that the friendships and connections that Harry made at Cambridge were to the direction of travel that his career would take him?
Well, it's certainly where he became very deeply involved with golf. As I said, he first appeared at Malvern in their minutes on April the 13th, 1887. That's 12 days before he matriculated as a as an undergraduate at Clare. Now, Mike Morrison, the Cambridge golf historian, has done a lot of research into this, and there is no evidence of Colt playing golf in Cambridge in his first year. He appears in the club's records not until 1888, and November 1988 at that, so the very end of the year. At which point he has been playing golf for less than 2 years. So I think that he either felt he didn't have time to play golf in Cambridge because he was too busy studying, or alternatively, he felt he wasn't a good enough player. When he first appears at Cambridge in November 1888, he is off a handicap of 6. As I say, now at that point, he's been playing golf for less than 2 years. So he's a 6 handicap within 2 years of taking up the game. So that tells you something about how he played. The same day, he was elected to the club committee, which is something of a surprise, considering how short a time he'd been involved. And he plays for the university for the first time in December and is in the top match. He plays his first varsity match in March of 1889, and he's at number 3 of the team. And he is made captain of the club in May of 1889. So he's only been in the club for 6 months, and he's made as captain. So as I said, the evidence is sketchy, but what is very clear is that he got good quickly. He remained captain of the club for several terms, and in March of 1890, he captained Cambridge in the varsity match against Oxford, which they won by 1 hole. They scored by holes, not by matches in those days. In terms of Cambridge's influence on him, in terms of friendships, Tommy Linskill, the founder of Cambridge Golf, was somebody who was a friend of his for a long time, and Linskill was a St Andrews man. So I haven't got evidence of this, but I suspect, bearing in mind that Colt joined the RNA in 1890, that Linskill might have proposed him as a member. He became a member of Littleston in, I think, 1891, in Littleston in Kent, proposed by a Cambridge friend and colleague. And obviously Littleston is not that far from Hastings and Rye, and it makes me wonder whether that had an influence on his eventual decision to settle in that area. But a lot of the key Cambridge influences happened after he left university. So John Lowe, for example, who was a very close friend of Colt's and obviously a very key influence on golf design in those early years, Lowe was at Clare as well. And it has often been suggested that the two were friends at university, but Lowe only arrived at Clare after Colt had left. Darwin similarly was a friend, but was not there at the same time. He was there quite a few years later. So in terms of connections, obviously Cambridge is important, but in terms of direct key friendships that were lasting, I think it's perhaps his actual years in Cambridge were perhaps felt to be more influential than they actually were. I think the foundation of the Oxford and Cambridge Golfing Society in 1897 or 8 was extremely influential.
It's funny, just as a complete aside, and I know I've mentioned this particular picture in the podcast, I think with Stephen Proctor, but a good mate of mine was actually in Rye Golf Club probably last year and took a phenomenal picture. Actually, this was just up on the wall. the Oxford and Cambridge Golf Society versus the Dublin Golf Club, I think from 1904 or 1903, something like that. And there's Darwin, there's Allison, and there's Stuart Patton, etc., etc., etc.
Stuart Patton, incidentally, did not attend Oxford or Cambridge, but was admitted to the society as sort of they made him a member because he was a good guy and a good friend of a lot of people. In strict terms, he shouldn't have been in there.
An honorary member,
yes,
but just for what he did in Woking, that's probably allowed. If we sort of move on, obviously, Harry, as we've said, did law at Cambridge.
And his brother George as well.
And his brother, beg your pardon?
Although he was not. His father George, interesting, started off as a solicitor, but then became a barrister towards the end of his life, which is interesting, but not germane really.
Obviously, he practiced law in the town of Hastings anyway, in East Sussex. Rye Golf Club, I believe, is located approximately 13 miles from Hastings. Mm-hmm. It would appear that Colt joined Rye not long after its founding in 1894, and as you mentioned earlier, he was also entrusted with the help of his former mentor, Dougie Rolland, to revise the original course at Rye. The new course would open for play in April 1895, I believe. 95 was also the year that he was made partner in the firm Sayer and Colt.
No, that was 1894. He became a partner as soon as he clearly bought into the firm essentially.
Your book, to clarify these things, couldn't more needed. The dates. It's funny when you try and do a bit of research. The dates actually are all over the place, and I know as other historians and writers sort of say, well, at the end of the day, trying to have everything 100% is pretty much a fool's errand. So, but thank you for correcting my mistakes. Obviously, it appears that golf was still Harry's main passion, and I believe he would become either honorary secretary or captain. I found, again, two different references with regard...
He was secretary of Rye for several years. He was captain. I think later he became captain.
Okay. I guess I'm just interested to understand, first of all, with regard to Rye, Adam, what do we know about the circumstances of Colt and Rolland's appointment as designers of the revised Rye Golf Club?
Well, I think appointment is rather too grand a word for that. The initial course opened in March of 1894. It was, I assume, extremely rough and ready, and it certainly didn't have any bunkers. There is a nice letter written by Colt to the local paper in March of 1894, talking about the club and the golf course, saying, that indeed, inland there is a fine stretch of good golfing turf, undulating in nature, bounded by water dikes and crossed by smaller ridges which form excellent natural hazards. Indeed, there will not be an artificial bunker through the whole links. He and Rolland added quite a lot of bunkers, so that clearly didn't last very long. But that initial course was obviously pretty damn rough, and it was almost straight away that they started to create the Colt and Rolland version, which opened in April 1895. Sorry, I keep saying 1995. As I say, I think to use the word appointed is a rather grand scheme of things. In those days, there was no real such thing as golf architecture. Your Tom Morrises and your Tom Dunns might swing by and spend a day walking across a piece of ground and saying, put a tee here, put a green there, put a tee here, put a green there, maybe dig a bunker here, maybe dig a bunker there. That was it. And if you didn't use Morris or Dunn, you might hire another local pro. And clearly, obviously, Rolland was the club pro. He was the obvious choice to help them redo the course. As well, also, he was the pro. He was there all the time, and he was in a good position to provide a lot of the labour. Colt was the best golfer in the club, and clearly a lot of the other members deferred to him in that respect. So I suspect it was a process of Roland was the person they asked to do the job, and Colt became involved by default almost.
So right place at the right time.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, I'm just kind of keen to understand if Colt ever collaborated with Roland post Rye, or was Rye the only collaboration he had with Roland from a design perspective?
There is evidence that they looked at a couple of other projects. In Hastings, when Rye was first mooted, there was no golf. The Hastings and St. Leonard's Club opened at almost exactly the same time. Now, that was a sort of cliff-top downland course outside Hastings. It wasn't the links. And it was originally laid out by Tom Dunn. In 1895, they added a second 9, which was Colt and Roland's work. They also advised in 1899 the Bexhill Club, again, pretty close by, on a potential move that didn't happen. But that is basically as far as I can prove anything between them in terms of him and Roland working together.
You know, I've not played Rye yet, but I do understand that essentially the golf course as it is currently is routed in and around and over and through a big dune spine that kind of runs down through the property. I'm just kind of wondering if what's there right now, how related to the 1895 revision of Roland and Colt.
The course has been revised a lot over the years, and on many occasions as well. There are bits here and there are bits there. As I understand it, what's there now is mostly the work of Sir Guy Campbell. How much original Colt there is still there, I do not know and have never had a chance to investigate that closely.
Okay.
But I don't think it's that much.
Cool. If we sort of move chronologically through a few further signposts, obviously 1897, Colt and John Lowe, who you mentioned previously, were founding members of the RNA Rules Committee, and we will come back to one of the more pressing concerns that they had with regard to ball technology in the early years of the 1900s. 1898, Colt, Lowe and Horace Hutchinson co-founded the Oxford and Cambridge Golf Society. Rye Golf Club became and remains home of the society to this day. I guess we sort of see Colt in 1899. The Royal and Ancient employed their very first full-time secretary and advertised their intention to do so. Colt applied for this position. Interestingly, his application included high-profile testimonials from renowned golfing luminaries of the day, including multiple amateur championship winner and rider Horace Hutchinson, Samuel Muir-Ferguson, who laid out the original course in New Zealand, and would go on to captain the RNA, and finally Arthur James Balfour, prominent amateur golfer, former Chief Secretary of Ireland, who would indeed succeed his uncle Lord Salisbury as Prime Minister in 1902.
Balfour was a member of Rye from pretty much its foundation, and there's quite a lot in the papers of the day written about Balfour appearing down at Rye to play golf. He must have been on that train down from London quite a lot.
Plenty of spare time, but the stands of it then. So, Colt was unsuccessful in his application. I'm just wondering, as a complete aside, do we know anything of Colonel Elliot, who I believe became...
Yeah, so basically, as you know, the RNA decided to appoint its first paid secretary in 1899. Interestingly, the motion to engage a paid secretary was proposed at an AGM by Herbert Fowler. Whether he had anything in mind, Fowler was born to a very rich family and lost all his money on several occasions. He was a terrible businessman. So, but anyway, Colt decided he would apply for that role. He put together, as part of his application, a quite remarkable set of testimonials. It was headed by Balfour on 10 Downing Street, headed paper. And he had letters from James Ogilvy Fairley, who was the son of the founder of the Open Championship, also from Hutchinson, from Muir Ferguson, from Ernie Blackwell, and from a lot of Hastings business leaders, all telling the RNA they couldn't get a better man. The RNA received 79 applications, and they created a shortlist of 5, which included Colt, obviously, 2 existing club secretaries, and 2 Scottish military men, one of whom was the guy who was appointed, and he was called Colonel William Elliot Lockhart. So he was appointed. He was a retired military man, and he had been formerly commander of the Royal Artillery Unit at Woolwich. And in that appointment, he turned around the officers' mess from being a loss-making to a profitable concern. So I suspect that's why they hired him. They thought he was a good businessman. As it turned out, he was only in the post for a year. He resigned in January 1901, and he was replaced by a guy called Fred Westley, who had previously been secretary and manager of the Piccadilly Club in London. What would have happened to Colt if he'd been appointed by the RNA is a very interesting question. How long he would have stayed in the role is obviously the sort of counterfactual that we can't possibly come up with. Whether he would have remained solely in the RNA, or whether he would have got interested in the changing nature of the golf business as opposed to relates to design. Again, it's impossible to tell. Those are total counterfactuals. But it's clear that by that time, around 1900, he was interested in spending more of his time within the golf sector. It's my theory that the foundation of the Oxford and Cambridge Golfing Society, which led him to spend a lot more time with his golfing friends, rather than being a country solicitor in Hastings, reminded him of how much fun he had when he was surrounded by golf people. It's pretty clear that he didn't do it for financial reasons. There is research that shows the average English solicitor in the year 1900 made £1,500 a year. Lockhart was appointed RNA secretary on £300 a year. When Colt eventually went to Sunningdale, he was hired on £150 a year. So he clearly didn't make the move for financial reasons, because he's taking a 90% salary cut. So it was obviously something that he very much wanted to do.
Yeah, I think probably it's safe enough to say that the RNA's loss was most certainly Sunningdale's gain. As you pointed out there, Colt was successful in beating off the challenge of 434 other applicants, apparently, for the position of founding secretary at Sunningdale. The old course of Sunningdale was originally designed by Willie Park Jr., opening to great acclaim in 1901. What can you tell us about the revisions that Colt would undertake to the Park Jr. course over his tenure at Sunningdale?
Well, the first thing to note is that they were very, very extensive. If you read all the early comments on Sunningdale, there are some very, very significant changes. Colt rebuilt quite a lot of the old course over his 12 years as club secretary. The par 3s at Sunningdale, which I would say are still not the course's greatest feature, but the par 3s, Darwin in particular said that they were, well, where are we? Almost as surely as the 2 short holes constitute its strength, the short holes are the weakness of the course. Really good and interesting short holes add a crowning glory to a golf course, and that, I think, Sunningdale lacks. It resembles, in that respect, another fine course, Deal, where the longer holes are admirable and the short holes are almost totally wanting in distinction. The short holes at Sunningdale are, however, much better than they used to be, for there was a time when they might have been rather scathingly dismissed as consisting of 2 practically blind shots onto artificial tablelands and a third entirely blind shot onto a bad sloping green. But this third approach has been at least now been entirely wiped out. Now that quote is from Darwin in the Golf Courses of the British Isles, which is 1910, 1911. So he's talking about what the course was originally like and then what it was like once Colt got to work. The 17th green is completely Colt. But basically, the course, he did revise the course quite significantly. And it is, I think, important to realize how quickly he became renowned as an expert in course design and greenkeeping. His early paid design jobs in 1907, 1908, he was already regarded as an expert on the subject when he got those jobs. He didn't develop it once he started practicing as an architect. So the impact of the Sunningdale years is very significant. It's important to realize how small the golf world was pre-World War I. Everyone knew Sunningdale, and everyone knew what Colt had done at Sunningdale.
And in fact, seeing some of his advertisements in publications, the reference to Sunningdale was centre to the advertisements. So he really leveraged the crap out of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. In about 1908, there had clearly been somebody said something to the press that basically said Sunningdale is Colt's course. Not in those words, obviously, but and that it really wasn't anything to do with Woolly Park. So he sent a letter to Golf Illustrated, an open letter, which was copied to Park, basically saying, "I didn't say this. I don't believe it. Everyone knows that you did, and please spread this letter so there's no not saying that." So yeah, it was open letter in 1908 when he says to Park, "Honestly, it wasn't me that's been saying this isn't your course." But it is a rather lovely irony that, and again, this shows you how small the golf world was in those days. That Colt has become accepted as a great expert on golf architecture without ever actually practicing as a golf architect.
And I guess sort of just jumping forward a little bit, and obviously you've already mentioned Mackenzie's involvement at Alwoodley in Yorkshire. I believe Mackenzie was engaged to design some holes, and obviously the committee were just concerned to get somebody that knew what they were talking about just to oversee. And in his second paying job, Harry Colt was dispatched to just check over what Dr. Mack had laid out, and I believe they got on famously.
Yeah, so Mackenzie was was a golfer. He was a member of at least one other club in Leeds, and he was part of the Alwoodley project from the start, and he was appointed as honorary secretary. The rest of the committee clearly were nervous about entrusting the design of their course to somebody who'd never done anything to do with it before. So they obviously Mackenzie again was pretty clearly a fairly strong-willed individual, and you can imagine him and the rest of his committee butting heads quite a bit. And eventually, somebody saying, as a compromise, "Okay, fine, we'll go with you if your plans are reviewed by an independent expert and are accepted as being the right thing to do." And that was when they hired Colt. And as you correctly said, that was Colt's second paying gig after his renovation of the Ganton course, which is his first paying gig. The interesting thing about it is that he was paid, if I'm right, £10 or £11 by Ganton for the work, and 20 by Alwoodley for just reviewing Mackenzie's plans. So what that says, I don't quite know.
Well, they obviously valued his expertise. Look, we might just sashay a little bit into the rules furore of 1902, which obviously related to the introduction of the Haskell ball. Coburn Haskell invented the first rubber cord golf ball, I believe in 1898, initially introduced into the USA, making its way to Britain in the year 1900. It's interesting to note the parallels perhaps to modern day RNA and USGA distance and site reports, which obviously relates to the ever increasing distances that the professional and elite amateurs hit the golf ball. In terms of the conversation that was going on with the RNA and the Rules Committee, ultimately they voted in favour for the continued utilisation of the rubber cord ball. Colt voted in favour, and his friend John Lowe voted against. Do we know how close the vote actually was?
No, we don't. If one would speak to the RNA, to the people in the St Andrews Golf Museum, they could probably review the RNA books and find out, but it's not something I've ever tried to do.
Okay. I guess just in general terms then, what do you feel the consequences of this particular introduction to golf design and the wider golf industry was?
It's essentially that was Colt's career. One of the interesting things about Colt's career is the number of pre-1905, whatever, courses that he rebuilt, even in those early years. And that was because they were all too short once the Haskell was brought in. Darwin said, when he was writing about Sunningdale, that it was fearfully long, and that it was one of the few courses that you could say was improved by the Haskell because it became more playable. And essentially, for the first, certainly up until World War One, a lot of Colt's work is essentially rebuilding older courses that have been rendered too short by the introduction of the Haskell. Now, I don't suppose he thought about that in 1902 when he voted for it to be accepted, but it is quite an interesting. It's quite an interesting irony, nonetheless.
Yeah, certainly is. Certainly is. I had that thought myself over the last couple of days. I guess if we look at Swinley Forest, a course that Colt was involved in designing, which opened in 1911. And an often used quote from Colt refers to Swinley Forest as his least bad course.
I've never actually been able to find the original. Now, that quote was supposed to have come in a letter to Tom Simpson, but I've never actually been able to find that actual quote. But it's one of those things that's so well attributed.
No, for sure. But it's assuming he said it, and I think it. From what I understand, it's probably in keeping with perhaps the sort of individual he was. But what do you think that comment, assuming that he said it, tells us about Harry Colt the man?
It's fairly well understood that Colt was certainly as an adult and as an older man, Colt was a very quiet, modest, typical English gentleman. He didn't like to. He wasn't somebody who was going to stand up and trumpet how great he was. At the same time, he was clearly quite good at selling his services. So let's just say it's a typically subtle statement and made by an intelligent man who realizes that in the middle class English circles of the day, shouting about how great you were wasn't a particularly sensible way to operate.
Yeah, and probably a counterpoint to his one-time partner, perhaps Dr. Alistair MacKenzie.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. I mean, MacKenzie was clearly a much more upfront guy, and perhaps that's why he felt so at home in the States. But speculative.
With the benefit of time, Adam, do you feel that Swinley still represents the zenith of Colt's design output?
I don't know. It's purely subjective in the end. No, there can be no doubt that Swinley is a fabulous course. There can also be no doubt that Swinley's reputation is enhanced by the nature of the club and how quiet it is and how special it feels to play golf there. Playing anywhere that's the haunt, that's the hangout of the elite in any activity tends to be regarded as being a special thing to do. And Swinley is a special place to play golf. Is it the best? I don't know. You make your own judgment.
Okay. It would be remiss of me not to deal very briefly with Colt in North America. As you said, he made 3 extended trips to the USA prior to World War I. and was involved in a number of projects such as Toronto Golf Club, which you mentioned, where Stanley Thompson was a member, Old Ellen in Chicago, where Donald Ross was appointed construction supervisor, and of course Pine Valley, where he assisted George Crump with some routing challenges on the now perennially rated #1 course in the world. Colt's longtime partner Hugh Allison would return to Pine Valley post-World War One to assist the committee in completing the course after Crump's death, and Allison obviously would subsequently base himself in Detroit as he built the firm's influence both in North America.
Only in the summers, apparently. He would always come home for winter.
Yeah, and obviously Japan, where arguably he had the same sort of influence that MacKenzie had in Australia.
Yeah.
Again, not particularly focusing on the USA, but it would be remiss of me not to mention those 2 or 3 particular points. Perhaps if we take a look at Colt specifically in relation to St Andrews, we obviously always hear of how much Dr MacKenzie revered the old course at St Andrews. I'm assuming that a similar reverence was held by his one-time partner, Harry.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Colt became, as I say, an RNA member in 1890. He won the RNA's Jubilee Vase competition, which interesting was a handicap competition, and obviously he was one of the club's elite golfers. But he won it twice in 1891 and 1893. Just as an aside, it fascinates me that he won the Jubilee Vase twice, but never really contended to win the King William IV medal, which is the RNA's principal scratch prize. And you tell me. My theory is that the Vase was match play and medal was medal play, and Colt was renowned as being a very strong match player, and perhaps was less formidable as medal play. But I don't know.
Well, I'll defer to your greater knowledge
anyway, so
wisdom on the topic.
Colt and St Andrews, yes, he remained a member of the RNA throughout his life. He actually proposed Dr MacKenzie as a member. MacKenzie obviously was not. Social class and the English is such a complex subject. But MacKenzie was born and brought up in Yorkshire, and although he was a Cambridge man, he was a medic, and he probably didn't mix in quite. He doesn't appear to have played golf in Cambridge, at Cambridge rather, and so he didn't mix in the same social circles as Colt did. MacKenzie and I, as a matter of interest, went to the same school. But one of the interesting things about Swinley, Colt's father, as I said, was a barrister. A big solicitor who became a barrister. So Colt was very solid middle class, but he wasn't by English establishment standards that posh. It was an anonymous middle class existence. By the time he gets to Swinley, it is some very elite people involved. The Earl of Derby is one of the people involved in the foundation of the club, and and at the time it was known as Lord Derby's course. So by that stage, Colt is mixing and hobnobbing with some of the grandest people in the country. So it's interesting of how he's gone up in the world. MacKenzie was not in those social circles because he's stuck in Leeds, and the elite don't hang out in
Leeds. Just dragging you back to Colt at St Andrews, the growing popularity of the game led to a requirement for additional capacity at the home of golf. Colt was selected as designer for the new Eden course. Claude Harris was obviously appointed as contractor, and the course was open for play in April 1914. Do we know, out of interest, who else may have been considered to design and build the Eden course?
I don't think anyone was, to be quite honest. So gestation of the Eden course is quite complex. Basically, in about 1911, 1912, there was a significant drought, and the old course suffered really badly. The old course at the time was free to play. And because it was controlled by the town, owned by the town, by the town, it was not possible just to say, we're going to propose a charge to play the golf course. The new course, which had been funded by the RNA, you had to pay, but you could play the old course for nothing. So there was a very long debate about imposing the first green fee on the old course. And what was eventually decided was that they would impose a fee, but if ground could be found, the revenues from that green fee, which was called the tariff, would be used to fund the creation of a fourth golf course. Colt was hired in 1911, 12 to review the condition of the old course and offer some suggestions on it. He actually didn't charge as a club member, although the club told him to do so, but he still refused to accept any money. And it was after that he was hired to design the Eden course. I can't prove it, but I don't think anyone else was ever considered.
Okay. I guess the Colts selection and construction of the Eden course at the home of golf surely cemented his reputation as the
I think yes. I mean, I know that Claude Harris, for example, was very proud as a Southern Englishman to have been hired to build a golf course in St Andrews. And I'm sure the same applied to Colts. You know, it is something that was always going to be on his CV. This guy's built a golf course in St Andrews. Yes, it's clearly very important.
Yeah, I think obviously it would be remiss of me, Adam, not to swing our conversation into Colt in Ireland, where probably I'm on slightly more firm footing. As with much of his work in England and Scotland, his efforts in Ireland were often focused upon reworking existing designs to obviously accommodate the increased distances that the golf ball was travelling, and reimagining perhaps a more strategic type of golf that came into vogue through the greater appreciation of strategic design principles as laid out by the aforementioned John Lowe in his Concerning Golf book. After the Great War, Colt seems to have been particularly active on the island of Ireland, with commissions undertaken at Royal Belfast, Royal Dublin, Royal County Down and Royal Portrush, to name but a few. What sort of importance would you place on the common founding membership gene pool across these clubs, I think personified by one Sir Anthony Babington? Might this be an example of groupthink, and if so, probably just as well that Harry Colt was a master of his trade?
Well, Anthony Babington was clearly very important to Portrush. I think he was involved in the Beaver Park project in Belfast in the early 20s, which was clearly where he and Colt came to know each other.
And in fact, sorry to interrupt, there's the third hole, I'm pretty sure, in Royal Dublin is called Babington's.
Oh, is it? I didn't know that.
It is.
Oh, well, there you go. Again, golf by that stage is bigger than it was in 1907, 1980, but it's still not that big a world. And the guys, Anthony Babington was somebody who would have travelled a lot, who mixed in elite circles, and yes, he would have been involved with or known to all the key clubs. If I remember rightly, Colt's first job in Ireland was at Rosapenna, which intrigues me. I mean, I've been to Rosapenna several times, and it frankly still feels like the back of beyond. Yeah. What the hell must it have been like when Tom Morris went there? What must it have been like when Paul went there?
If you think about it, he got there via stage.
Yeah, you went by ship originally. I've talked to the Caseys about this, and there's some questions to whether Colt would have gone by ship. There was railway, not all the way, but then there was some kind of light railway part of the way, according to John and Frank Casey. It's hard to tell. But yeah, Rosapenna must have been, that part of Donegal must have been bloody opened.
We've a saying here, and excuse the crassness of the language. Rosapenna, with the greatest respect back then, was in the arsehole of nowhere.
Yeah, the arsehole of nowhere. But if you want to be really, really, it's actually in the forehead end of somewhere, because it's right at the top rather than the bottom.
Yeah. And I guess it's probably useful just for those that don't know. Rosapenna was the world's first golf resort, initially opened in 1891, with an old Tom Morris rating. In between Morris and Colt, the triumvirate of Varden, Taylor and Braid appeared to have made a number of suggestions improvement-wise. I understand that Colt visited in 1912 with a review to redesign the golf course. This visit led to the creation of at least 11 new holes. In his book Beyond the Lordship's Wildest Dreams, Pat Ruddy suggests that the course works that Colt oversaw were so dramatic that they involved the installation of a narrow railway line to import loam and other materials up the old Tom Valley.
I didn't know.
Writing in 1927, Colt said it's difficult to write with restraint about Rosapenna. The exceptional beauty of the surroundings is liable to interfere with unbiased criticism.
Yes, he clearly loved the place. There's no doubt about that. And you having said that, who wouldn't? It's a glorious place. But...
yeah, I think they now have 11 or 1,200 acres under management between the 63 holes they have up there.
It's fascinating how that place is going to change now that they have the St Patrick's course. I've been interested to follow that project for several years, and what fascinates this is a total aside, but what has always fascinated me about St Patrick's is that the resort didn't need any more golf. What it needed was a true marquee course, and it's got one now. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But basically, and the Cases are well aware of this, they're playing in the big leagues now.
It probably does lead me to think, do you think that Mr. Colt himself would approve of the new St Patrick's links?
Oh, there's speculations. I'm sure he would. How would he not? It's a fabulous course. But total speculation.
Of course. I guess we maybe move on to renovations at my own golf club, Royal Dublin, post-World War I. The club was originally founded in 1885, and for the first few years it led a nomadic existence until the early 1890s, where it found a permanent home on a growing lowland sandbar within Dublin Bay. The original course at Dollymount was laid out by club founder John Lumsden, assisted by the Scottish professional Tom Gilroy. The golf club lands were requisitioned by the British Army, as happened to many golf clubs around that time during World War I, to facilitate musketry training for soldiers bound for the trenches in Belgium and France. During the course of its military use, much of the internal site contour was flattened to facilitate trench digging, musketry ranges and officer accommodation. In conjunction with returning the golf club property to its members, the British Army paid £10,000 towards the reinstatement of the facility, and Harry Colt was selected to reimagine the golf course. What can you tell us about Colt's efforts towards refreshing the dilapidated post-war Royal Dublin?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is in what you just said. You know, they'd got a big fat slug of money from the army. They were able to spend it on not only reinstating their golf course, but actually upgrading it. I don't know a vast amount about Royal Dublin. There's an interesting article from Colt was there in 1920. There is there was a great deal of work in this. There had to be removed a tremendous growth of grass, as well as a huge rampart stretched across the ground in front of the Alps bunker, which was used for the targets, and many other obstacles constructed by the musketry school. So clearly, the original course was of the Victorian school. It wasn't really a strategic golf course, and Colt made it so. And that really, as I say, is a lot of Colt's career in a nutshell, taking old established golf courses that were not designed in accordance with the strategic principles that Lowe and he had formulated, and transforming them so that they were.
Through the intervening years, John Morrison, Sir Guy Campbell, Eddie Hackett and Martin Hawtrey have all advised and revised Royal Dublin. The members have recently approved a Clayton de Vries and Pont bunker plan aimed at reconnecting the club with Colt-inspired strategic interest and variety, which is great. Again, and this is probably more just reporting on something I suspect you won't know a huge amount more than this with regard to Portmarnock, but it does appear that Harry Colt visited Portmarnock Golf Club in 1919, and a report was issued to the committee with respect to suggested improvements and amendments. I know Ali McIntosh has spoken to you about this. He's also spoken to me. Works were actually carried out in Portmarnock, I believe, during the 1920s by a delightful sounding gentleman called Hugh Guppy Cairns. Now, Ali reckons that possibly Cairns used Colt's report as a guide or reference point. The works associated with this timeline would include a new green at the sublime par 4 14th and the creation of the iconic par 3 15th that's routed parallel to the Velvet Strand, presenting panoramic views of the Irish Sea, Lambay Island and Ireland's Eye and the Howth Peninsula. Have you been able to find any reference or additional reference to Colt's visit to Portmarnock?
So there are two things. One is the only hard evidence we have of Portmarnock is there is a Colt and Company advertising brochure published in 1930 which lists the courses with which they're involved, and Portmarnock was listed as a course which had been advised on some reconstructions. But I've never been able to trace any prima facie evidence of a visit or a works. Ali says there was a report written in 1919 that was lost in the clubhouse fire, and that he believes that the Cairns work in the 20s was basically implementing Court's report. Morrison also wrote a report on the course in 1938, which led to a couple of holes being reconstructed. But this is all derived from McIntosh. There is no corroboration as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, goddamn clubhouse fires.
Yeah, always the case. So many of them.
I know I had suggested that we were just going to be doing Ireland, but Muirfield is obviously the next one up on the list, and I do appreciate that's not in Ireland. But 1923, obviously, the Honourable Company of Edinburgh Golfers moved from Musselburgh Old Links out to the relative boondocks of Duncur Road in Gullen. The original 16-hole, actually that doesn't make any sense. The original 16-hole golf course was laid out by old Tom Morris. Obviously, Morris was long dead at that stage, so it obviously wasn't 1923. But 1923 was when Colt was involved.
It was 1893, I think.
There we go, thank you, and apologies to HCEG for making that bloody mistake. An additional 50 acres was obviously purchased by the club in 1923. Here we go with the 1923 stuff. And Colt was engaged to redevelop the links to make the most of the extra real estate. For those unaware, Colt's reworking in Muirfield, actually originally the Tom Morris routing seemed to have two concentric rings of 9 holes.
Yeah, it's long believed that the idea of the two loops routing is something that Colt created. That's not true. That's a Tom Morris innovation. Colt retained the basic model of the routing, although it was almost entirely changed as a result of his work. Because, as you say, basically there was a wall at the north end of the course, and beyond that wall, between there and the fourth, was 50 acres of Linksland, which they acquired and took in. And there were, let me have a look. I'm looking at the plan now. There are 4 or 5 holes almost entirely in that land, and several of them that cross over the where the wall was. So it was a pretty major major change.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the constant change in direction facilitates infinite variety through continual variations of playing angle relative to wind direction. Do we know, just as an aside, where old Tom got the inspiration for his concentric?
All I can say about that is that obviously most of the old traditional links were out and back. It's also worth noting that the majority of pieces of old links ground are quite narrow. So if you have an area of ground that's very narrow, going out in one direction and coming back on there isn't effective and efficient use of land. If you have, as at Muirfield, a much wider, deeper patch of links land, then you can move about it in a different sort of way.
Yeah. Moving back to the island of Ireland in 1926, obviously old Tom Morris was involved in the initial iteration of 18 holes across the dunescape at Newcastle back in the late 1890s. The club would go on to to become Royal County Down, with additional improvements and suggestions being sought from Braid, Varden, Taylor and Sayers over the years. Colt, I believe, was engaged during 1925, and that the alterations that materialised saw the creation of both the present par 3 fourth hole and the remarkable par 4 that closes out the front nine. The stretch of the course benefited greatly from Colt's revision, which spliced two old holes together, creating what we now know as the ninth. What can you tell us about what you found out about Colt's time in Newcastle?
Not much beyond what you just said. There is still, as everyone knows, a lot of blindness at Royal County Down. One presumes that there was even more before Colt was there. The old 8th and 9th were both blind holes. The new 9th is, as everyone knows, a world-class hole. Colt said that when the various alterations have been completed, the long course will be one of the finest in the kingdom. No one can argue with it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you'll allow me a little bit of leeway here. I'm just going to take a look at Mackenzie's Australian trip, actually, from a chronological perspective, 1926. Obviously, urban myth suggests that Royal Melbourne may have initially approached Colt, perhaps through the RNA, to investigate whether he might be disposed towards travelling to Blackrock and Melbourne to design their new golf course. Probably at this stage.
I've never seen anything suggest that, by the way.
No problem.
It may be true, but I've never seen any evidence of it.
No problem. I guess let's just perhaps wonder for a moment. Yeah, I'm actually going to borrow a question from a recent episode of the very well recommended Australian Golf Passport podcast, where Scott Warren or Matt Malika, not 100% sure which gentleman posed this question, but how might a Colt visit have differed in terms of outcomes and influences on Australian golf? And I do appreciate this is pure conjecture.
I don't really think there's anything of any value that we can say about it, to be brutally honest. I mean, Colt and Mackenzie shared most of the same principles.
Yeah.
They had different ways of working and were very different people. One can perhaps say that Mackenzie's slightly more brash and upfront manner perhaps tallies more closely with the sort of Australian psyche. You can imagine Colt running into some Australians and being called a stuck-up commie bastard or something like that, but you know, I don't know. There's so much that is there. I don't see a lot of point in wasting energy.
No, I got you. Okay,
like
no problem. Spot on. That's cool. Onwards to 1927 and Colt and Allison's revisions at Ross's Point. County Sligo Golf Club was, of course, founded in 1894. An original 9-hole course was designed by George Coombe. In 1906, William Campbell extended the course to encompass 18 holes. Colt was invited to visit the course in 1927. Ultimately, what have you been able to unearth of note with regard to the redevelopment of County Sligo?
Not a great deal, really. There's an interesting article from January of 1927 that says Colt's been invited to come over, and then just a few bits and bobs from 28. This obviously from the Irish newspapers. There was, I recall there being a certain amount. I've only been to Ross's Point once. I recall it being, by the standards of a links, relatively up and down. There was less. Colt reduced the amount of climbing, but that's really the only thing of note that I can. The work was, I know, completed by the end of 1928, and also interestingly, apparently, there was. I don't quite know how the routing or the ground that was used changed as a result of Colt's work, but it's interesting that apparently there were basically beforehand there were some places on the course where tourists, trippers, as was said at the time, would hang around watching the golf, whether it was schoolboys nipping onto the course and stealing golf balls, as has happened, I don't know, but that was apparently removed by Colt's work, and and as I say, a degree of climbing on what was the old 11th hole was something that was removed. But beyond that, I don't really know very much.
So we'll move on maybe to Royal Portrush's commission of both the Dunluce golf course, which opened in 1932, and the Valley course followed in 1935. The county club was founded in Portrush as a 9-hole course in 1888, and obviously the ubiquitous Old Tom would visit in 1889, and his suggestions would see the course being extended to 18 holes with the royal designation arriving some 3 years later. Colt was engaged with the club in 1922 that is, and spent a week surveying the property. The output of his survey amounted to a routing plan that encompassed 54 holes no less. Again, Franks Harris were appointed contractor as per the Eden course in St Andrews, with the Dunluce opening for play in 1933, I believe. Am I correct in assuming that Colt's routing for the Dunluce moved the course eastwards towards the cliffs at White Rocks and away from the environs of the train station and the town centre?
Yeah, the whole Portrush thing is a very long-term project. Dr. MacKenzie was actually hired by the club back in 1919, and he came up with a scheme. Yeah. So McKenzie's scheme was described as virtually a reconstruction of the course. I don't know why it didn't happen, but the club had no security of tenure at the time. The local landowner could basically take the land off them whenever he wanted, if so chose. So they decided fairly early on that they needed to obtain a proper lease on the ground, and once they had an agreement with the landowner for that, they needed a lot of money, and that's why it all took so long. I think the Portrush Club was not in a position to fund a project like that. And certainly a number of people had approached the local railway company to help them fund it, presumably on the grounds that a really good golf course in the town would increase the visitor traffic there, and basically it all took a long time to put together. The actual build was not slow. So the Colts scheme was approved, amazingly, in July of 1924.
Okay.
Anthony Babington was involved that far back. So they needed a new clubhouse, they needed a new ladies' clubhouse. Colt was brought in, as I said. I'm not sure why they didn't stick with the Dr. MacKenzie report that they had. He advised them that the best thing to do was to make one first-class course on a big scale and to have a second course working more or less in the centre to convert near the clubhouse into a course for ladies and children, perhaps other players who did not desire extra physical exertion. So Lord Antrim, who was the landowner at the time, had, as I say, they had no security of tenure. And that was the first thing that they wanted to sort, and then they needed to sort the money. I imagine the Depression made that rather more difficult, but by 1931-32, they had figured out a way to fund it, and the course opened, as you said, in July 1933.
And of course, the Valley would appear 2 or 3 years later as well. So
I don't know a great deal about the Valley course.
It's one that always gets left in the shadow, and I can assure you, having played it on a number of occasions, it's probably the 6th or 7th best golf course in Northern Ireland. It's that bloody good. Like,
the interesting thing, as I understand it, about the Valley is that it's almost, apart from the holes that were lost to build the 2 new holes for the Open.
Yeah,
it's almost exactly as Colt left it, which is pretty interesting. There are not many of those.
Yeah, and obviously with the reworking of the 2 holes on the Dunluce, which obviously removed a short par 4 and a longish par 3 that were kind of separated all unto themselves on the Valley. there was a couple of different things. At the 18th, a new hole, it's a short par 4, and maybe one of the par 4s in the back 9 was extended into a par 5. There's one or two additional new holes, I think, that M&E have been involved in terms of the revision with the new holes or onto the
they're changing the uphill par 5, I believe, and they either are or have redone the green, the 7th hole.
Okay. No, I haven't been up since May, but I didn't play. I only played the Dunluce, so I wasn't down.
No, I meant on the Dunluce.
Oh, beg your pardon. So one of the new holes they're changing.
Yeah, the
par 5?
Par 5 that Martin built. I believe they're redoing the green.
Okay.
Or have done.
Interesting. I'm sort of interested just to take a look at, and one thing I haven't given you advance warning on this. One of the omissions that I didn't mention was Colts' involvement with Royal Liverpool. What, if anything, do you know about that?
Well, that was done in a number of different iterations. He was there at least twice in 1913, and then again in 23-24. Interestingly, Colt and Hoylake were both born in the same year. The club dates from 1869, as did Colt. Hoylake is a fascinating place because it was obviously it was somewhere that went below the radar for many years, having lost the Open for about the best part of 50 years. But at the time, it was regarded as one of the very greatest golf courses. John Lowe was massively a lover of Hoylake. Colt introduced the here we go. So the 10th at Liverpool, obviously the most, going back in history, the most famous par 3 at Liverpool is the 7th, the Delhi, because it used to have out of bounds basically right against the green, which was removed some years ago. And that was regarded by Darwin as being one of the best short holes in the world. One of the other famous holes in the original Hoylake was the 10th, which had a big punch bowl green. Colts basically removed it and created a new green up in the dunes. If you've been to Hoylake, you'll be aware that most of the course is very flat, but there's a road, lower dunes by the sea. The original course didn't really go into those dunes. Colt took it up there. Then when he went back in 23-24, he created several new holes, including the what was the famous 17th, the Royal hole, where again the green was hard against the road, and you could basically put out of bounds. That had to be rebuilt in order to take the Open back there, because there was just fundamentally no way of getting the spectators around it. And that plays now as the 15th hole, because they've changed the routing, which incidentally I think is a shame, because the single most famous thing about Hoylake is the first hole with the out of bounds behind the cop and where the practice ground is. And I personally think it's sad that that's not the first hole any longer.
Yeah, and obviously they put that, MacKenzie and Ebert have designed another par 3, the 17th I think it is, with blowout bunkers and a very difficult perch green.
Which is, I must say, my friend James Bledge is the new course manager at Hoylake, and I've discussed that hole with him, because it's clearly absolutely spectacular, but it also clearly looks nothing like anything else at Hoylake.
Well, but arguably it looks quite similar to M&E's work at Hillside and the Island Golf Club in Dublin.
Yeah, I mean they have a way of doing things, let's say.
Indeed. I guess maybe taking a look at some of the commercial partnerships that Harry Colt seems to have had over the years that may have been used at increasing both awareness in and the development of the Colt design brand. I'm aware of his collaboration with both Carter's and Sutton Seeds. Can you tell us whether Colt and his partners had any other commercial relationships that assisted in gaining commissions or introductions to prospective new clients?
Not that I've seen. The Carters and Suttons thing is interesting because obviously they were very close. They were basically deadly rivals, and Sutton's, there is quite a bit of Sutton's original material out there, and they had a bee in their bonnet about Carter's. They felt that Carter's were very good at getting in there quickly and finding out that golf projects were happening and getting the business before anybody else knew about them. So Sutton's hired Colt quite early in his career as an advisor. They paid him a retainer, not a commission, and the agreement was that he would promote their seeds on his projects. But that didn't stop him working with Carter's. But I haven't got much evidence of him working with Carter's in the UK. But Carter's were absolutely fundamental to his work in North America. They certainly got him his first jobs, Toronto and Detroit in 1911, and quite a lot of Colt's work through his 3 US trips was to courses where Carter's were. Carter's were in the States before Sutton's. Carter's had an American operation quite early. They were a very progressive company, and they clearly played an important role in developing Colt's career in the States.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can take a look at something that Colt is always mentioned as a master router. Okay, so in addition, obviously, to the importance of the quality of a site for golf, it's widely recognised that the utilisation of the site through the development of a compelling and sympathetic routing that fits the specific property is important. Colt is considered to be a master router of golf courses. What process or processes did he utilise in the course of formulating the orientation of his routing for his courses?
Well, it varies. Certainly, places like Swinley and St George's Hill. St George's Hill is a very interesting one because the site was originally completely and densely wooded. So Colt routed that course through a forest. How the hell he did it, I don't know. Because he didn't have months and months to spend walking around and around that site, and he couldn't possibly have had a topographic map to have done 20 kind of modern standards. So the routing of St George's Hill is something of a miracle in many ways. I don't know how the hell it was done. Swinley was done basically by walking the site. And the routing of Swinley is quite interesting because if you look at the overhead of Swinley, there's a lot of ground out there. The ground was it was leased from the Crown basically, and as Colt's routing existed before the property was secured, the original developer, Alexander Sutherland Green, and Colt were basically partners on the job. And Colt spent a lot of time exploring that ground and creating his routing. Then he put it together, and Green then went away and talked to the Crown Estates representatives and secured a lease on the site that was needed. So that's very unusual. Normally, obviously, golf architects give the piece of ground and said, route a course on that. Colt said, here's an enormous area of heath. Go route a golf course, and then we'll figure out how we're going to get the land and build it. As far as routing techniques is concerned, as is well known and is very commonplace nowadays, Colt routed by way of par 3 holes a lot. He would generally place his par 3s where there was broken ground. So if it was somewhere where there was a ravine or a quarry or something, you could bet that Colt would build a par 3 there. It's interesting that at Addington, which Colt designed along with J.F. Abercrombie, Frank Pont, who is currently restoring the golf course there, is fairly convinced that the Colt did not do the routing, at least on his own, because there's a hole at the top of the golf course where Frank says, if this was a Colt routing, this would be a par 3, and it's not. And I think that's quite a compelling theory. Colt would often use, again, which is a very common technique now, he would use long par 5s, or longish. He didn't like very long holes. It was very rarely a hole significantly over 500 yards on Colt's courses. He would use par 5s to occupy the most tedious ground. If you go to Southfield in Oxford as an example, There are two back-to-back par fives going to and from the clubhouse at the 9th and 10th across the most boring ground on the property. He was just bloody good at it. There's not really much else that one can say.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps your comment about the Addington sort of gives me a nice little sachet into just his view on trees, gorse, and vegetation. Perhaps I might read out a quotation from the great man himself, and it goes a little something like this. Where the ground is covered densely with trees, it is often possible to open up beautiful views by cutting down a little additional timber. It would be unwise to create narrow lanes required for play. Every endeavour should be made to obtain a free and open effect. How did Colt feel about the utilisation and maintenance of trees, gorse and vegetation on a golf course?
Well, no golf architects like trees that close to their holes already, and Colt was no exception to them. No exception to that. He felt that trees were not a good hazard, which is pretty much unarguable. And where he had a significant quantity of trees, he would try to clear as much as possible. And St George's Hill, for example, there were many thousands of trees cut down, and there were hundreds and hundreds of men building the golf course and cutting down the trees. Vegetation generally, Colt was probably the first, this isn't a vegetation point, but Colt was probably the first guy to sort of understand the landscape value of golf courses. He wrote that when somebody goes away to play golf, he likes to pick somewhere pretty, but it's not. But what people don't realize is that they like playing golf in pretty places. He was one of the first people to understand that the landscape value of a golf course was an important component to its value, of its overall value.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at his career in totality, obviously it commenced somewhere around 1895 and concluded with his death in the early 50s. During that approximately 50
years... Actually, to be fair, it concluded with World War II. He was completely retired after.
So 40 years then, so I suppose. Obviously over that 40-year period, the world experienced significant change. Golf was, of course, not immune from the societal, technological, and even the evolution of golf equipment. I'm keen to understand how Colt's philosophy from a design perspective evolved over time. Perhaps we can look at this through three specific headings: drainage and irrigation, bunkering, and green site selection.
So drainage, yes, it's important. Interestingly, he wrote at one point that he initially had not felt that artificial water was important, but that he'd come to change his mind. And he was probably there was no automatic fairway irrigation systems in those days, obviously. But Colt played an important part in getting water laid onto golf courses to allow the watering of greens, which, as I say, he initially didn't believe was necessary, but came to realise quite quickly that it was. Green site selection, I'm not convinced that there's much to be said about that. He believed that picking the putting green sites was at the core of golf design. His bunker style is quite interesting. If you read the early stuff, pre-World War I, it's all about bunkers that were torn out of the land. Often into natural upslopes, but if you imagine a natural upslope and then a giant hand going in and tearing half that away, that was how he wanted his bunkers to look. So very natural ragged edge. In the 20s, as he's working with Francis Harris, almost not exclusively, but a lot of the time, he starts to develop a more formal, complex edge. And if you look at the 1920s Francis Harris built courses, they often have a more complex but constructed edge of the sort of shape that the old course at Sunningdale now has. After Martin Hawtrey worked there about 10 years ago. And then towards the end of his career, he starts to embrace a very complex, lacy-edged, almost Simpson-esque bunker look. And Manor in Worthing is a very good, which is one of his last courses, is a very good example. A very good example there. So basically, he goes. I won't say he goes through 3 phases, but that's the route which he went in terms of bunkering. But you must also remember that compared to a golf course done today by one of the elite crews, whether that be Tom Doak's crew or Gil Hans's crew or whatever, those guys are building the golf course features themselves. So the architect has a much more hands-on influence over how things look. Colt had a degree of that because he was working with a contractor and with foremen that he knew quite well. But at the same time, he wasn't on site every day. He wasn't saying, dig a bunker this shape. It was a more organic process.
Mm-hmm. In terms of many of the G, B and I courses associated with Colt, a lot of them have been revised, reimagined, redesigned, restored and perhaps even wrecked, delete as appropriate over the years. In your experience, do you feel, in general terms, that these Colt courses have kept faith with the underlying design principles that the great man espoused, or something else?
Some have, some haven't. It's not really all you can say. And the restoration movement, which has been very popular in the States for 15, 20 years, has only really started to get any traction in the UK over in very recent years. You know, I don't want to name names, but there have been projects where they've been claiming to restore what Colt built and then built something that looks absolutely nothing like what Colt would ever have built. And that, you know, that's commonplace. I think that's regretful, but you know, if people do it, it's their golf course.
What sort of legacy do you think that Harry Colt has left the world of golf?
He created the professional golf course architecture. That's really the most fundamental thing. My friend John Challenger in Chicago, he and I worked quite closely on this. When Colt was in Chicago in 1913 building Old Elm, there was a dinner at the start of his trip at which basically all the significant golf courses in Chicago were represented. And John says that dinner is the start of the golden age in Chicago. And essentially, Colt created the golden age is my basic contention.
Yeah, that's not a bad legacy, is it?
No, that's not.
In terms of his writings, you chastised me relatively recently on Twitter when I suggested that the great Harry didn't write that much. It appears, though, through your research for the book, you've uncovered significant heretofore forgotten writings from Colt.
It's all very busy, Shane. There are not huge art. There isn't a, apart from his books and essays on golf course architecture, there isn't an article that says, this is my philosophy on golf design by Harry Colt. There's a bit here and a bit there and a bit elsewhere, and that's really it.
I suppose for those looking to gen up a little bit more on Colt, while waiting for your new book, More Enduring Than Brass, the books available heretofore are Fred Hawtrey's book Colt & Co., published in 1991, which I believe is out of print. Peter Pugh's Creating Classics, published in 2008. Anthony Galtz's book on Colt and Allison's work in North America, which was published in 2018 and available online.
Tony's working on the second edition of that as well.
Oh, very good. Okay, there's obviously also a number of publications with chapters and articles written by Colt. These books include The Book of the Links, first published in 1912, and some essays on golf course architecture, published in 1920. That sort of concludes the Colt element for the time being, but I'd like to understand, you obviously founded Oxford Golf Consulting in 2012. I'm interested to understand what sort of projects you get involved with on behalf of golf clubs that may seek to take advantages of the services that you offer.
I've not been doing that much recently, but essentially, obviously, I'm a marketing and journalism guy who's become very focused on history. So I'm interested in helping clubs understand their history and how that relates to the evolution of their course, I'm interested in helping document clubs' history, and I'm interested in helping clubs understand what they have. And I'm not a golf architect, and I don't seek to be a golf architect, but I do have some knowledge about how you go about enhancing or altering the golf course. And I'm interested in helping clubs not mess up their golf courses fundamentally. There have been a lot of golf course projects that have resulted in something that was not better than where they started. If I could have a legacy, it would be reducing the number of those projects.
Yeah, so I guess to a certain degree, maybe you're fulfilling a degree of the role that Bradley Klein does over in the United States, just to, as Bradley says himself, just
Bradley's quite hands-on with some of his projects, I think.
Yeah, what does he suggest? That giving the golf club committee or the golf club a bullshit radar in terms of trying to understand the questions to ask and the systems and processes and procedures to go through in terms of briefing properly and understanding what you can and cannot do.
Yeah, that's not a bad assessment.
Obviously, you have also, you're the editor of Golf Course Architecture magazine, which you mentioned in the introduction.
Yeah, and let's get back to writing the October issue.
Yes, well, I'm keeping you from that particular deadline, but thank you very much for facilitating the conversation in the midst of all of that. I'm just interested to know how you've managed to pivot from business journalism to writing about your passion for golf course architecture.
It was a complete accident. In 2004, I went to work for Tudor Rose as the head of editorial. Tudor Rose at the time was a technology publisher, and I was a business and technology journalist. But at the time, Toby Ingleton, who's one of the two brothers who owns the company, still does, was working on a magazine about golf course. Was hatching the idea of a magazine about golf course design, and by an odd evolutionary process, I ended up writing mostly about golf course design. End of story.
How bad? How bad? Happy as a pig in proverbial.
Well, I don't make as much money as I might have done otherwise, but I have more fun.
It's all about finding a job that doesn't feel like a job, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it's a very good assessment.
Right, we're down to the final two questions, and I ask all of my guests the same final two questions. You are undoubtedly a very well-travelled golfer. What 5 courses or indeed destinations are on your bucket list? You have a degree of flexibility here. Please interpret the question in whatever manner works best for you.
Oh. I still haven't seen Pine Valley, and I really must. I want to go to Landman in Nebraska, which my friends Rob Collins and Tad King opened last week. I haven't seen Royal West Norfolk, Brancaster, and I've wanted to for years and years. That's 3. I haven't seen El Soler in Spain, and I really want to. One more. I'd like to see Tairiti in New Zealand and the other courses that are being built around there at the moment.
TRI, yes. I was talking to Clyde Johnson when he was down probably back in February or March. Himself and Angela and Tom were hard at it. It seems to be coming together pretty well, but the north and south course there. So I've that on my bucket list as well. So you're in good company. The final question, Adam, with regard to the interview and the podcast, relates to augmenting our collective golf book libraries. What 2 books would you recommend that golfers should purchase to add to any personal golfing library?
In my opinion, everyone should have a copy of Darwin's Golf Courses of the British Isles, and everyone should have Concerning Golf by John Lowe.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad to report I have both of those, so... Listen, many thanks for your time today, Adam. It really is appreciated. You might just share with people, in conclusion, where people can find you on the socials, how they can perhaps subscribe to Golf Course Architecture magazine, and indeed find out more information on Oxford Golf Consultants.
Well, let me think. I'm on Twitter. I'm at Oxford Golf Cons. On Facebook, both with myself and I have an Oxford Golf Consulting page. We have a website, obviously. For golf course architecture, you should visit golfcoursearchitecture.net, where we publish news regularly, and also the magazines are available, and you can subscribe to the paper magazine. That's about it, really.
Well, I'm sure that the new Colt book will be a triumph upon release, and I look forward to pre-ordering my copy.
Let me put it this way, Shane. My initial thought when I started to work on it was that I wanted to launch the book at the Portrush Open in 2019. Mm-hmm. I didn't.
But there is another one coming up in Portrush.
I know, and that wouldn't be a bad time to do it. But several years later.
Yeah. So any update on when we might?
The trouble is, I'm trying to write a very long, complex book while trying to earn a living. Yeah. And it's not the easiest thing in the world.
I can imagine.
Let me just put it this way. I keep all my research stuff on Dropbox. Mm-hmm. There is a folder in my Dropbox folder called Colt Book Files. That file is 3.95 gigabytes, including 5,592 items.
Is that all?
It's a lot of work.
That sounds like a multi-volume book is potentially.
Well, I'm trying very, very hard for it not to be. Let's just put it that way. But it's already getting longer and longer, a lot longer than I had intended. So if there's anyone out listening there who's a really savage editor and has a very sharp blue pencil, give me a call.
Adam, on that note, it has been a great pleasure to host you on the podcast today. Many thanks for your time and your expertise, and best of luck with the book. I look forward to seeing it when it comes out.
Thanks, Shane. Catch you soon.
Cheers, mate.
Take care.
Many thanks for tuning in. As usual, you can find us online at firmandfast.golf or on Twitter at firmandfastgolf. Please continue to like, subscribe, and comment. It really is appreciated. Until the next time, happy golfing.